There is a verb in this passage that appears at the exact moment the miracle happens, and most English translations render it the same way every time. Eulogio, to bless. Jesus takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looks up to heaven and blesses them. Then he breaks them and gives them to the disciples, and the disciples give them to the crowd. That word blessed feels almost ordinary here, a liturgical reflex, something Jesus does before every meal. But the problem is that this word, eulogio, is not the typical word for giving thanks over bread. Matthew could have used Eucharisteo, which Paul uses at the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians, and which appears elsewhere in the Gospels. But Matthew chooses eulogio here, and he uses it again in chapter 26, when Jesus takes bread at the table with his disciples, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them with those words, "Take, eat, this is my body." The feeding of the 5,000 and the institution of the Lord's Supper are tied together by a single verb, and that connection changes what the miracle is actually about. The crowd that day was not a liturgical assembly. They were a desperate, hungry, exhausted mass of people who had followed Jesus into a deserted place on foot. Matthew says Jesus had compassion on them, and that word is splanchnisomai, a visceral, gut-level stirring, the kind of feeling that moves a person from pity to action. Jesus healed their sick, but as the day wore on, the disciples saw a problem that needed a practical solution. It was evening. The place was remote. The people had no food. The disciples came to Jesus with what seemed like a reasonable request: send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy themselves something to eat. It was the obvious answer. It was the responsible answer. It was the answer that any good manager would give. And Jesus looked at them and said something that must have sounded absurd: they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. The disciples had nothing. They had already taken inventory. 5 loaves and 2 fish. That was it. That is the detail that everyone reads past. The disciples did not say, "We have nothing." They said, "We have only 5 loaves and 2 fish." They had something. It was insufficient. It was laughably insufficient for a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children. The gap between what they had and what was needed was so vast that the only reasonable response was to admit the impossibility. But Jesus did not ask them to produce more. He did not tell them to go find food. He took what they had. He took the insufficient, the ridiculous, the embarrassingly small offering, and then he blessed it. The word blessed here is not a magic formula. In Jewish practice, to bless bread was to pronounce God as the source of all provision. Jesus looked up to heaven, an act of dependence, not of conjuring, and he blessed. The blessing came first, then the breaking, then the giving. And the sequence matters because it is the same sequence that will happen in an upper room on the night before he dies. The feeding of the 5,000 is not primarily a miracle of multiplication. It is a miracle of transformation through thanksgiving. The loaves and fish did not suddenly replicate themselves like a rapid growth science experiment. The text says Jesus took, blessed, broke, and gave, and they all ate and were satisfied. The emphasis is on the giving and the satisfaction, not on a mechanical increase. The miracle is that the blessing of God made the insufficient sufficient. But here is the tension that the text does not resolve in this moment. Jesus gives the broken bread to the disciples, and the disciples give it to the crowd. Why the middlemen? Why not hand the multiplied bread directly to the people? If the point was simply to feed the hungry, Jesus could have done it himself. He could have spoken, and bread appeared in every hand. He could have manna from heaven, but he did not. He placed the broken pieces into the hands of the disciples and made them the distributors. That is a detail that feels like an administrative redundancy until you realize that the disciples are being trained for something they do not yet understand. They are standing in the gap between Jesus' blessing and the crowd's need, and they are learning that their job is not to produce the food. Their job is to carry what has been blessed. The person who brings 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus is not the hero of this story. The hero is the one who blesses the insufficient and makes it enough. But the person who brings 5 loaves and 2 fish is not useless either. That is the exact point where the story becomes personal for every person who has ever looked at their own resources, time, talent, money, patience, love, and concluded that it is not enough. The conclusion is correct. It is not enough. But the story is not about the amount. The story is about what happens when the insufficient is placed under the blessing of Jesus. This is why the word eulogio matters so much. A dictionary definition will tell you that it means to speak well of, to praise. But in the context of a meal, it means to acknowledge God as the source and to consecrate the food for its purpose. When Jesus blesses the bread, he is doing more than saying grace. He is transforming the meaning of that bread. The 5 loaves no longer represent the disciples' meager resources. They become the vehicle of Jesus' abundant provision. The same thing happens in the upper room. The bread is not just bread after the blessing. It becomes his body. And the same thing happens every time the church gathers at the table. The bread is blessed, broken, and given, and those who eat are satisfied with something that no multiplication of groceries could provide. The application here is woven directly into the fabric of the story. The disciples' instinct was to send the crowd away because the resources were insufficient. That instinct is theologically correct in a purely mathematical frame. It is also theologically disastrous in the frame of the kingdom. The kingdom does not work on the logic of supply and demand. It works on the logic of blessing. And the logic of blessing is this: what you bring to Jesus will be transformed, but you will still have to carry it and give it away. The disciples did not get to sit back and watch the fireworks. They had to distribute. They had to touch the bread. They had to walk through the crowd, hand after hand, with nothing in their own hands except what Jesus had blessed. And at the end of the day, they collected 12 baskets of leftovers. The supply did not just meet the demand, it exceeded it. But there is a problem in this story that the text does not immediately answer, and it has to do with the disciples themselves. They saw Jesus heal the sick. They heard his teaching. They had been with him long enough to expect something. Yet when he told them to feed the crowd, their first response was to count what they had and declare it impossible. They had not yet learned that insufficiency is precisely the condition Jesus requires. The miracle did not happen because the disciples had great faith. The miracle happened because Jesus took what they had and blessed it, and the disciples were obedient enough to carry it forward. That obedience was shaky. It was hesitant. It was probably mixed with confusion, but it was enough. And that is the detail that everyone skips. The disciples did not understand what was happening as it was happening. They were not heroes of faith in this moment. They were men carrying bread they did not believe could feed anyone, and the crowd was fed anyway. Which means the person reading this passage who feels like their offering is small, and their faith is small, and their obedience is half-hearted, is exactly the kind of person Jesus is working with. The story does not require you to believe that your 5 loaves are actually 50. It requires you to hand them over. The blessing, the breaking, and the giving are Jesus' job. The carrying and the distribution are yours. And that is the point where the story reaches towards something the disciples could not yet see. They thought they were solving an evening meal problem. They were being trained for a lifetime of feeding the hungry with bread that would one day be his body. They thought they were solving an evening meal problem. They were being trained for a lifetime of feeding the hungry with bread that would one day be his body. But the training did not end when the crowd was seated. It intensified when the meal was over. Matthew adds a detail that seems like an afterthought, a logistical note that most readers skip on the way to the next story. After everyone had eaten and was satisfied, the disciples collected 12 baskets of broken pieces that were left over. 12 baskets, not 11, not 13, 12. Each of the 12 disciples walked away from that hillside carrying a full basket of leftovers. And the word Matthew uses for baskets here is a specific term, kaphinos, a small wicker basket that a Jewish traveler would carry with him to hold kosher food when journeying among Gentiles. It is not the same word used for the large baskets in the feeding of the 4,000 later in the Gospel. This basket is personal. It is the kind of basket a disciple would have brought with him when he left home to follow Jesus, which means the leftovers were not simply discarded surplus. They were collected into the very containers the disciples had carried with them, and each man received a basket full. The miracle did not end with the crowd being fed. It ended with each disciple holding proof that the blessing had produced more than enough. That detail resolves a tension that has been building since the disciples first counted their 5 loaves. They brought their insufficiency to Jesus, and he blessed it. but they were still standing there, holding the baskets, looking at the abundance. The miracle was not that they never had to worry about scarcity again. The miracle was that they now knew experientially, not theoretically, that scarcity under blessing becomes superabundance. The 12 baskets are a visible, physical, undeniable demonstration that what Jesus does with small offerings is not merely meet the need but overflow it. And the fact that each disciple carried his own basket means that the proof was distributed. Simon Peter did not have to take Thomas's word for it. He had his own basket. He had his own memory of the bread passing through his own hands. The word chortazo appears in verse 20. It means to be fed to the point of fullness, to have one's appetite completely satisfied. It is the same word used in the Old Testament for God feeding his people in the wilderness with manna. But here it is not manna falling from heaven. It is bread that passed through human hands. The disciples were not just spectators of abundance. They were the conduits of it. And that is a crucial theological distinction because it reframes the entire episode as a pattern for the church. The church does not create the bread. The church cannot generate the abundance. But the church is the appointed distributor of what Jesus has blessed. The disciples did not produce the miracle. They carried it. And they have been carrying it ever since. This is where the present-day reader must sit with the weight of the text. The instinct of most people who read this story is to focus on the magnitude of the miracle and to feel either awe or skepticism. But the text itself is less interested in the mechanics of multiplication and more interested in the participation of the disciples. Jesus could have fed the crowd without them. He chose not to. He involved them in the giving. He made them touch the insufficient and then touch the abundant. That is not a practical decision. It is a theological formation. The disciples were learning that their role was not to have enough, but to be faithful with what they were given. And that lesson would be tested again and again, most painfully in the upper room when Jesus would take bread, bless it, break it, and give it to them, and tell them that this bread was his body given for them. They did not understand that either, not until after the crucifixion. But the pattern was the same: take, bless, break, give. The feeding of the 5,000 was a rehearsal for a meal that would define the church. There is another tension hiding in this passage that most readers miss. After the feeding, Matthew says Jesus immediately made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. The word immediately is jarring. Why the urgency? Why send them away so abruptly, right after they had just witnessed a staggering miracle? The answer may be found in what comes next. The disciples spend the night fighting a storm, terrified, and Jesus walks to them on the water. The two events are connected. The feeding was a lesson in abundance. The storm is a lesson in trust. The disciples had just seen that Jesus could take their insufficiency and make it more than enough. But they had not yet learned that Jesus himself was sufficient even when the boat was sinking. The sequence forces them and forces the reader to move from the miracle of provision to the deeper miracle of presence. The bread was not enough. They needed the one who blessed it. The Greek word euthys immediately creates a narrative stitch between the two scenes. Matthew does not want the reader to sit comfortably in the memory of the full baskets. He wants the reader to feel the transition, the abrupt shift from abundance to danger, from the hillside to the storm. And that transition is itself a theological argument. The disciples had been given proof of Jesus' power over material need. Now they would need proof of his power over fear and chaos and death. The feeding was a lesson for the hands. The walking on water would be a lesson for the heart. So the feeding of the 5,000 is not a standalone story. It is the first half of a two-part education. The disciples were taught that Jesus provides. Then they were taught that Jesus is present. And the two lessons together form the foundation of everything they would do after the resurrection. They would stand before hungry crowds again, not on a hillside but in Jerusalem, in Samaria, in the ends of the earth. They would have no bread to offer, only the gospel. But they would remember that insufficiency under blessing becomes abundance. And they would remember that the one who blessed the bread also walked on water in calm storms and rose from the dead. That memory would sustain them. The application for the present-day reader is not primarily about trusting God for groceries. It is about understanding that the pattern of the kingdom is participation, not passivity. The disciples did not sit back and watch Jesus do magic. They were drafted into the distribution. And the church has been drafted ever since. The bread is still blessed. The breaking still happens. The giving still requires hands. The miracle does not bypass human agency. It flows through it. Every believer who brings their 5 loaves, their limited time, their insufficient patience, their faltering love, their inadequate resources, and places them under the blessing of Jesus is stepping into the same pattern. The outcome is not guaranteed by the size of the offering. It is guaranteed by the one who blesses it. The 12 baskets remain as a sign. They are not just a historical curiosity. They are a promise that what is given to Jesus will not only meet the need but will overflow. And the overflowing is not for hoarding. It is for distribution. The leftovers were not left behind. They were collected and carried forward. The disciples carried them to the next shore. The church carries them into the next generation. The bread that was enough for 5,000 became the bread that would sustain the apostles on their journey. And the bread that the church receives at the table every Sunday is the same bread, blessed, broken, given, carried by hands that are still not sufficient, still trembling, still doubtful, but still obedient. So the heaviest truth of this passage is not that Jesus can feed a crowd. It is that he will feed them through you. He will take your insufficiency, bless it, break it, and place it in your hands, and you will walk through the crowd offering what you never believed could be enough. And at the end of the day, you will find that your basket is still full. The abundance was never yours. The blessing was never yours. But the carrying was, and that is enough. You are not the source. You are the distributor, and the one who called you to carry is the one who will fill your hands.